Midnight, June 7, 1931. The night air was still, cool, and heavy with silence. Across the towns and villages of eastern England, families were fast asleep in their beds, dreaming quietly as the world around them seemed frozen in calm. Out at sea, the waters of the North Sea stretched endlessly into the darkness, calm as glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. In Yorkshire, a church bell tower pierced the night sky, standing proudly as it had for centuries, a symbol of permanence in a world that often felt uncertain. But beneath this surface of peace, beneath the seabed of a place known as Dogger Bank, pressure had been building. Silent, unseen, waiting for its moment to be released, came without warning. At 1:30 a.m., the stillness of the North Sea was broken by a violent jolt. The earth itself began to shudder. What began as a faint, low rumble grew into a deafening roar that rolled across the seabed and shook the British Isles awake. In that instant, the calm was shattered, and the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in the history of the United Kingdom had begun. Imagine it: walls rattling, floorboards trembling, windows clattering in their frames. People sat upright in their beds, gasping as pictures fell from the walls, as crockery tumbled from shelves. In towns along the Yorkshire coast, chimneys cracked and collapsed. In the town of Filey, a church spire twisted violently, bending under the sudden force of the quake. Miles away in London, wax figures at Madame Tussauds trembled in the darkness, and the waxen head of the infamous Dr. Crippen tumbled to the floor, rolling across the museum floor like something out of a nightmare. Across the country, panic spread. To the people of 1931, earthquakes were not supposed to happen here. Britain was far from the great fault lines of the world, far from the violent seismic zones of Japan, California, or Chile. Earthquakes belonged in newspapers in far-off places, not here in the quiet heart of Europe. And yet, the tremors reached into homes across England, shaking not only buildings but also the very idea of safety. For many, it felt as though the earth had betrayed them. This was not a minor tremor. This was a seismic event measuring 6.1 on the Richter scale, the strongest earthquake ever to strike the British Isles in recorded history. Its epicenter lay deep beneath Dogger Bank, a shallow part of the North Sea some 60 miles off the Yorkshire coast, but its power reached across borders. The quake was felt not only in Britain but also across Belgium and France, rippling through the soil and rattling the nerves of thousands. But here's the question: what really happened that night? What did the people of England experience? And what secrets did the sea unleash in the early hours of June 7, 1931? Because this earthquake did more than just crack walls and topple chimneys. It sent strange waves racing across the North Sea. It dislodged cliffs, it frightened sailors, and it left scientists with mysteries they struggled to explain. What if I told you this wasn't just a random natural event, but a reminder of something far more haunting? That this earthquake was a signal, a whisper from beneath the earth, that Britain, though far from tectonic plate boundaries, is not immune to nature's fury. For centuries, the North Sea has hidden its secrets. Lost land swallowed by the ocean, ancient peoples who once walked across land now buried beneath the waves, and fault lines buried in silence. On that June night, one of those secrets erupted into the open. A moment lasting less than a minute, but powerful enough to make history. As we step back into that night, into the moment the ground beneath Britain shook with a force never seen before, ask yourself, what would it feel like if the earth beneath your feet, the solid ground you trust every single day, suddenly betrayed you? And what if the sea itself, the calm, sleeping North Sea, rose with it, carrying a wave that reached for the shores of England? This is the story of the night the North Sea shook. The story of the most powerful earthquake in British history. A night that terrified thousands, a night that toppled monuments, and a night that even today leaves scientists searching for answers. Because while the tremors faded and the buildings were repaired, the earth does not forget, and neither does the sea. The early 1930s in Britain was a time of quiet hardship. The Great Depression, which had begun in 1929, had swept across the globe, and the United Kingdom was not spared its heavy hand. Factories that had once roared with the sound of industry now stood silent. Men lined the streets of towns from Yorkshire to Glasgow searching for work that no longer existed. Families scraped together meals from what little they had, and poverty crept into homes that had once known comfort. The country was weary, carrying the invisible weight of economic despair. People looked for stability in the few things that seemed certain: the ground beneath their feet, the rhythms of daily life, the tides of the North Sea. Earthquakes, for the British, belonged to another world entirely. They were something that happened in stories carried across oceans: quakes in far-off Japan, or the deadly tremors in Chile or California. When such disasters were mentioned in newspapers, they felt distant, tragedies to be pitied but never feared. The idea that Britain could shake, that the earth itself beneath the green fields, the cobblestone streets, and the quiet villages could turn violent, was unthinkable. After all, the British Isles sat far from the grinding edges of tectonic plates. To most, the United Kingdom was a land of storms and floods, yes, but not a land of earthquakes. At this time, the science of seismology was still in its infancy. Instruments had been built to measure the vibrations of the earth, but understanding was limited, and public awareness was even thinner. Few people in Britain had ever heard of the Richter scale, which had only recently been introduced. If you asked the average person in 1931 what they knew of earthquakes, most would have described them as exotic curiosities, terrible but confined to lands far away. This belief would make what was to come all the more shocking. Out at sea, far from the gaze of most Britons, lay a place called Dogger Bank. To fishermen, it was a familiar name, one that carried with it the promise of livelihood. Dogger Bank is a vast sandbank in the middle of the North Sea, stretching across hundreds of miles. The waters there are shallow compared to the surrounding sea, and for centuries fishermen from Britain, the Netherlands and Scandinavia had cast their nets in its bountiful waters. Cod, herring, plaice. Dogger Bank was a name associated with abundance, with tradition, with the everyday grind of life at sea. But beneath that seabed lay something very different. Beneath the sands and silt, beneath the shoals where fishing boats bobbed in the currents, there were ancient geological scars. Millions of years ago, when continents collided and drifted apart, fractures spread across this part of the Earth's crust. Over thousands of years, pressure built up in these hidden faults. Most of the time, these stresses shifted silently, unnoticeable to human life above. But every so often, when the strain grew too great, the Earth would lurch. Dogger Bank, that trusted fishing ground, was not simply a rich shoal. It was a fault zone, a hidden weakness beneath the North Sea. Few people knew this in 1931. Even scientists had little sense of the scale of what was possible beneath those waters. To most, the idea that the peaceful fishing grounds could conceal danger seemed absurd. Dogger Bank was seen as a place of work, not of threat. But in hindsight, it is clear that the ground beneath those waters was ticking like a clock, its gears turning in silence, its hands moving slowly toward midnight. Picture the world of a fisherman on the eve of that June night. He hauls his nets in the chill of early morning, the sea calm, the gulls circling above. The routine is the same as it has always been: work, weather, and the sea. He looks at the horizon, where the dark water meets the sky, and he sees only peace. He cannot know that miles beneath his boat, stresses are tightening like a rope pulled to its limit. That is what makes the story of the Dogger Bank earthquake so chilling. It did not strike a land braced for disaster, nor a people prepared by experience. It struck a country struggling under the weight of poverty and despair, a nation clinging to certainties. It struck a people who believed that their island was immune to such violence. And it struck beneath waters known not for fear, but for livelihood. The United Kingdom in the early 1930s was searching for hope, for stability, for some sense that the hardships of the Depression would eventually pass. Yet on June 7, 1931, just when people thought the only things they had to fear were joblessness and hunger, the earth reminded them of something far more primal. Beneath the surface of their lives, beneath the surface of the North Sea, danger had been building all along. Dogger Bank was, and remains, one of the most remarkable features of the North Sea. Its shallow waters and vast size made it a hub of activity for centuries. but in geological terms, it was a sleeping giant. The truth was that this peaceful fishing ground, trusted by generations of seafarers, was sitting on a hidden time bomb. And in the early hours of that summer night in 1931, that bomb went off. The night of June 7, 1931, began like any other. The people of Britain went to bed with their worries still weighing on them. Worries of work, money, and the slow grind of daily survival during the Great Depression. No one expected that the ground itself would betray them in the hours to come. At 1:30 a.m., while most of the country slept, the earth beneath the North Sea suddenly convulsed with a force that would ripple across nations. It began as a low, almost unnoticeable hum deep beneath Dogger Bank. Fishermen sleeping on their boats later described it as a distant groan, like the sound of something massive tearing itself apart far below. Then, without warning, that sound roared to the surface. A magnitude 6.1 earthquake burst through the seabed, shaking water, land, and sky in one violent instant. The shock waves raced outward, striking the east coast of England within seconds. In the city of Hull, where families lived tightly packed in rows of brick terraces, the shaking came with terrifying clarity. One family, fast asleep in their beds, was jolted awake as their walls began to groan and the floorboards shuddered beneath them. Crockery crashed to the floor in the kitchen, their carefully stacked plates shattering in the darkness. A child screamed, clutching her blanket, as her father rushed to the doorway, unsure whether to stay inside or run into the streets. Outside, the narrow chimneys that lined the rooftops trembled like reeds in a storm. One after another, bricks gave way, and entire stacks toppled, crashing into the roads below with deafening booms. For the people of Hull, it felt as though the very heart of their city was being torn apart. Farther up the coast, in the town of Filey, the quake struck with eerie precision. The parish church, a proud stone building that had stood for generations, seemed to twist in its foundations. The spire, rising tall into the night sky, shuddered violently. Witnesses later said it looked as though it had been wrung like a cloth in invisible hands. The twisting was so severe that the spire never fully straightened, leaving behind a scar that spoke of the night the ground betrayed them. Inside the homes of Filey, furniture shifted across the floor, lamps swung wildly, and walls cracked as if the houses themselves were groaning in pain. But the quake did not spare even the capital. In London, more than 200 miles from the epicenter, the vibrations carried through the ground and rattled the city awake. At Madame Tussauds, the famous wax museum, the tremors shook glass cases and lifelike figures alike. In the eerie silence that followed, one figure became the stuff of legend. The wax head of Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen, one of Britain's most infamous murderers immortalized in wax, broke free from its body. It fell with a heavy thud onto the floor and rolled across the ground, as though the quake itself was reminding Londoners of old horrors. The surreal image of a murderer's head tumbling through the museum in the dead of night seemed to embody the strangeness of the entire event. All across eastern England, the story repeated itself. In Scarborough, Whitby, and Burlington, frightened families poured into the streets, clutching candles and lanterns, their faces pale with fear. They looked up to see dust rising from the cliffs at Flamborough Head, as massive chunks of earth broke away and fell into the sea below. In small villages, old brick chimneys crumbled, scattering debris across gardens and courtyards. Doors rattled on their hinges. Windows shattered. Dogs barked frantically in the dark, their instincts more attuned to the danger than their owners could ever be. The sensory details of that night seared themselves into the memories of those who lived through it. The sound was often described as a roar, a deep and terrible growl from the earth itself. People recalled hearing it before they felt the shaking, a sound that rose from beneath the ground like a warning. Once the tremors began, the world became a blur of noise. Glass shattering, timber creaking, masonry crashing to the ground. It was chaos born from the silence of a single summer night. Children cried in terror, clutching their parents, asking questions no adult could answer. Was it the end of the world? Was this some kind of punishment from God? In towns and villages, priests and pastors would later describe how their congregants prayed that night, whispering frantic words as though faith alone could steady the trembling earth. And then there were the strange lights. Across parts of the East Coast, witnesses spoke of flickering glows in the sky, faint but unmistakable. Some described them as flashes of blue or green, others as eerie sheets of light dancing above the horizon. Today, scientists suspect these might have been earthquake lights, a rare phenomenon caused by electrical discharges in the ground during seismic stress. But to the people of 1931, the lights only deepened the sense of dread. To see the earth shake and the heavens glow, it felt like a message, though no one could agree on what it meant. The quake did not last long, perhaps less than a minute in total, but in that short span, it rewrote what the people of Britain thought possible. A land that was not supposed to tremble had trembled with frightening force. A country that prided itself on stability, on permanence, had seen its very foundations shiver. And though the shaking ended, the unease lingered. People stood in the streets long after the quake had passed, afraid to return indoors, waiting for something else to strike. Some swore they felt aftershocks, tiny ripples that might have been imagined, or might have been the Earth's final sigh. For those who experienced it, the Dogger Bank earthquake was not just an event, it was a revelation. It showed that the solid ground of Britain could betray them, that beneath their lives lurked forces beyond comprehension. The stories of that night would live on for decades, told in hushed tones by those who remembered the roar, the shaking, the lights, and the fear. That night, the sea and the land had spoken in one voice, and it was a voice no one in Britain would ever forget. When the earth stopped shaking in the early hours of June 7, 1931, many thought the terror was over. The roar had faded, the chimneys had fallen, the people of Hull, Filey, and countless other towns were left blinking in the darkness, shaken but alive. Yet the earthquake had left behind something else, something far stranger. Out at sea, the waters of the North Sea behaved in ways that no fisherman, no coastal resident, and no scientist in Britain had ever quite expected. For centuries, the North Sea was thought to be dangerous for storms, yes, but not for great waves. Tsunamis belonged to the Pacific, to Japan, to tales of distant devastation where the ocean itself rose up against the land. The British Isles, with their storms and floods, were not supposed to experience such things. But in the moments after the Dogger Bank quake, the waters whispered a different story. Fishermen out at sea that night later told of boats rocking in violent, unnatural patterns. These were men who had lived their entire lives on the water, men who could read waves like others read books, and what they saw unnerved them. The swells came not with the rhythm of the wind or tide, but with sudden jolts, as if the sea itself had been punched from below. Nets tore loose, lanterns swayed dangerously, and for a brief period it seemed as though the calm surface of the North Sea had been replaced with something alive, restless and angry. On shore, the accounts were just as unsettling. Along parts of the East Coast, observers reported waves surging higher than normal, moving in ways the tide did not account for. In certain harbors, the water seemed to rush in and out as if the sea was catching its breath. There was no storm, no gale to blame, only the memory of the quake and the evidence of the sea itself shifting unnaturally. Some described it as a small tidal wave. Others, with no frame of reference, could only shake their heads in confusion. It wasn't enormous. There were no towering walls of water sweeping inland, no towns swallowed whole as would happen in later decades in the Pacific. But it was enough to prove something Britain had never truly considered, that even here in these waters, tsunamis were possible. The quake had shaken the seabed with such violence that the displaced water rose and traveled outward, rippling toward the shores of England. By the time it reached land, the wave had lost its killer edge, but its existence alone was a revelation. The very idea that the North Sea could spawn a tsunami felt almost like blasphemy. In the newspapers of the day, coverage of the quake focused mostly on the dramatic images of broken chimneys and twisted spires. The wave was mentioned briefly, if at all, and in time it faded into obscurity. It was easier, perhaps, for the public to forget that the ocean, too, could betray them. Easier to believe that such terrors belonged elsewhere. Yet those who witnessed it never forgot. The fishermen especially carried that memory. Imagine standing on the deck of your trawler in the dead of night, only to feel the sea heave beneath you in a way it never had before. Imagine gripping the rails as the vessel lurched, not from wind or current, but from a pulse sent through the very water itself. For men who had faced storms, shipwrecks, and the endless unpredictability of the sea, this was something altogether different. Some would later call it a freak event. Others, with fear in their voices, whispered of the seabed cracking open, of the sea responding like a wounded beast. And it begs a haunting question. If it happened once, could it happen again? Scientists today know that the British Isles are not immune to tsunamis. History provides grim reminders. The Storegga slide, thousands of years ago, when a massive undersea landslide off Norway sent walls of water crashing into the Scottish coast, drowning entire landscapes. The Dogger Bank wave was not of that magnitude, but it was a warning, a glimpse of what the sea could do if stirred by seismic violence. In 1931, though, such knowledge was limited. The wave was downplayed, dismissed as an oddity, a minor curiosity in the shadow of the quake itself. Yet in hindsight, it was perhaps the most chilling reminder of all. Britain was not beyond the reach of tsunamis. The North Sea, usually thought of as a place of fishing, trade, and storms, had shown its other face, a face of hidden danger. The night the earth shook, it also moved the sea. A small wave, yes, but one that carried with it a truth that is easy to ignore until it is too late. If the ground beneath Dogger Bank could rupture once, what is to stop it from doing so again? And if the wave that followed was small in 1931, what would happen if a future quake, or an undersea landslide, were to strike with greater force? The answer is uncertain, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most unsettling of all. The fishermen who rode the strange waters of that night could not explain what they saw, but they knew instinctively that they had glimpsed something rare, something dangerous. The wave has long since passed, but the possibility it revealed still lingers over the North Sea, like a shadow waiting for its time to rise again. When dawn broke on June 7, 1931, the first rays of sunlight revealed a nation in shock. Across the east of England, people emerged from their homes to see the scars of the night written in brick and stone. Chimneys that had once crowned rooftops now lay in piles of rubble in the streets. Dust still lingered in the air where walls had cracked and crumbled. In towns like Hull, Filey, Beverley, and Burlington, families stood outside in their nightclothes, speaking in hushed tones, replaying the events of the night again and again, as though saying the words aloud might make sense of them. The newspapers were quick to seize on the story. By morning, headlines across the country screamed of the quake of a century. Some papers described it with astonishment, while others leaned into sensationalism, painting images of a nation nearly brought to its knees. Photographs showed shattered chimneys, cracked roads, and the twisted spire in Filey that became an emblem of the quake's power. For a country unaccustomed to such disasters, the very idea that Britain had experienced its most powerful earthquake was enough to grip readers with both awe and fear. But alongside the facts came rumors, and they spread like wildfire. This was 1931, and Europe lived in the long shadow of the First World War. Though a new conflict had not yet begun, tensions lingered, and whispers of foreign threats were never far from people's minds. Some insisted the tremors had been caused not by nature but by man, perhaps an explosion or some secret weapon being tested at sea. A few even suggested that enemy powers were experimenting with ways to shake Britain's foundations, a chilling thought that played on lingering anxieties of espionage and sabotage. For many ordinary Britons, though, the quake's impact was more personal than political. Shook their sense of certainty. If the very ground beneath them could not be trusted, what else might betray them? Until that night, earthquakes were something that happened over there, tragedies that belonged to foreign lands. Now they were a reality at home. The psychological effect was profound. Some families refused to return to their beds for days, sleeping instead in chairs or even outdoors, fearing another tremor. Children cried at the slightest noise, flinching whenever a cart rolled heavily down a cobblestone street. The quake had cracked more than stone walls. It had cracked the illusion of safety. There was also tragedy, though mercifully less than the scale of the quake might have suggested. In Hull, amid the chaos of falling chimneys and shuddering homes, an elderly woman suffered a heart attack brought on by the shock. She died before help could arrive, becoming the quake's sole recorded casualty. Her death underscored a sobering truth. Even when earthquakes do not flatten cities, the fear they unleash can prove just as deadly. Yet, as in so many disasters, there was also resilience. In the days that followed, communities rallied to rebuild. Men gathered bricks and mortar, climbing onto rooftops to repair chimneys and patch walls. Carpenters shored up weakened beams. Neighbors checked in on one another, ensuring the elderly and infirm were cared for. In Hull, Burlington, and Scarborough, families shared meals when kitchens were unusable, and children were comforted with reassurances that the danger had passed. The quake had frightened thousands, but it had also reminded them of the strength found in community. Still, rumors persisted. In pubs and markets, people debated the true cause of the quake. Some insisted it was divine punishment, pointing to the strange lights seen in the sky as evidence of a heavenly warning. Others clung to the idea of enemy interference. A few, remembering stories of lost lands beneath the North Sea, whispered of Doggerland, the ancient world swallowed by the ocean thousands of years ago. Was the quake a stirring of something buried deep below? Such theories had little basis in fact, but in the absence of understanding, people reached for whatever stories made sense to them. The government and scientific community did their best to calm nerves. Reports were published confirming the quake's magnitude, 6.1 on the Richter scale, the largest ever recorded in the British Isles, and assuring the public that such events were exceedingly rare. Yet the explanations did little to ease the deeper unease. Rare or not, the quake had happened, and once something unthinkable occurs, it can never be completely dismissed again. Children, in particular, carried the memory with vivid clarity. Teachers reported classrooms full of nervous students in the days after, their attention wandering to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, their eyes darting to the walls whenever a door slammed too hard. Parents told bedtime stories not to entertain but to soothe, reminding their little ones that the ground was steady, that the world was safe, even as they themselves lay awake at night, doubting those very words. As days turned to weeks, life slowly returned to its rhythms. Newspapers moved on to other stories. The rubble was cleared. The spire in Filey stood as a permanent reminder, and the quake became one more entry in Britain's long history of unexpected trials. Yet beneath the surface of recovery, something had shifted. The quake had left behind not only physical damage but also a lingering sense of vulnerability. Britain was not untouchable. The ground beneath their feet was not beyond the reach of nature's power. 4 years afterward, those who lived through it would recall that night with a mixture of fear and awe. They remembered the roar, the shaking, the collapse of chimneys, the flicker of strange lights, and the silence that followed. They remembered gathering with neighbors in the streets, staring at the rubble in disbelief, whispering rumors in the half-light of dawn. And above all, they remembered the feeling, the cold realization that their island, their homes, their lives, rested on foundations not as solid as they had once believed. The Dogger Bank earthquake had struck swiftly and passed in less than a minute, but its aftermath lingered in the minds of a nation for far longer. It was more than a geological event. It was a psychological turning point, a reminder that even in Britain, where the land had always seemed steady, the earth could rise up without warning. The fear eventually faded, as all fears do, but the lesson never fully disappeared. The sea and the land had revealed their power, and from that day forward, Britain could never again say with certainty that such things could not happen here. Beneath the calm surface of the North Sea lies a hidden world of fractured rock and ancient scars. Scars that tell a story stretching back tens of thousands of years. To understand the mystery of the 1931 Dogger Bank earthquake, we have to journey deep into that buried past, into the bones of the earth itself. At first glance, Britain doesn't seem like the kind of place where earthquakes belong. Earthquakes, people imagine, belong to the fiery edges of the Pacific, to the trembling coasts of Japan, or to the restless valleys of California. Britain, by contrast, sits far from the great collision zones of tectonic plates. There are no smoking volcanoes here, no yawning rift valleys, No jagged mountains still rising from the Earth's restless push and pull. Yet on that June night in 1931, the North Sea itself rose and roared, and the land shook as if it were pinned to some invisible giant turning in its sleep. How could this be? The answer begins with Dogger Bank itself. Today, it's a shallow sandbank beneath the North Sea, famous for its fishing grounds. But thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, it was not a seabed at all, it was dry land. Vast plains, known as Doggerland, stretched between Britain and mainland Europe, home to mammoths, hunters, and villages now lost beneath the waves. Over time, rising seas swallowed this world, drowning its forests and burying its rivers beneath silt. But the land did not vanish. Beneath the water, the old bedrock remained, laced with cracks and seams, ancient fault lines left behind by forces far older than human memory. These faults are the ghosts of ancient catastrophes. They were carved when the Earth's crust heaved and stretched, when ice sheets miles thick pressed down upon Britain and then melted away, releasing their weight and allowing the land to rise back up. This process, called glacial rebound, is still ongoing even today. Imagine a mattress dented by a great stone. Remove the stone and slowly, over centuries, the mattress swells back into shape. Britain's crust is that mattress. The last ice age ended around 10,000 years ago, but the rebound has not yet finished. The Earth is still shifting, still sighing from the weight it once bore. In 1931, scientists had only the faintest grasp of these ideas. Seismology was in its infancy. Britain had only a handful of seismographs, and most people had never heard the word fault line. To them, the quake was an inexplicable anomaly. Some even doubted the reports at first. Surely, they argued, such a thing could not happen here. When the data rolled in, though, there was no denying it. The instrument showed a magnitude 6.1 shock centered on Dogger Bank, 60 miles off the Yorkshire coast. It was, and remains, the strongest earthquake ever recorded in the British Isles. But why there? Why Dogger Bank? Geologists began to suspect that the shallow seabed itself was part of the answer. Beneath its sands lies a complex web of faults, many of them invisible at the surface. For millions of years, the region had been a site of quiet stress. The Eurasian plate, on which Britain sits, does not rest entirely still. Though far from its boundaries, stresses ripple inward from the collisions of plates elsewhere. These stresses find their release in old scars, reawakening ancient fault lines that had lain dormant for millennia. Dogger Bank, as it turned out, was one of these weak points. Modern science has gone even further. Today, with satellite imaging and seafloor surveys, geologists have mapped hidden fractures beneath the North Sea. They've discovered that Dogger Bank is a kind of seismic pressure valve, a place where the Earth occasionally vents the stress that builds in its crust. Add to this the slow rebound of the land from its icy past, and the stage is set for earthquakes, even large ones, right where no one expects them. This knowledge, however, only deepens the mystery. If Britain is not supposed to have quakes, why was 1931 so strong? Was it a once-in-a-thousand-year event, or a sign of more to come? Some researchers believe the Dogger Bank earthquake was extraordinary but not unique, that other quakes of similar size may have shaken Britain in prehistoric times, their traces lost to history. Others warn that the region could stir again. While most British earthquakes are small and barely felt, Dogger Bank is different. It remains a seismic hotspot, a slumbering fault zone that could, under the right conditions, awaken once more. The thought is unsettling. Britain, for all its history, has never built with earthquakes in mind. Its cathedrals, its terraced houses, its centuries-old villages, they are monuments to stability, not resilience. If a quake of 1931's magnitude were to strike today, the damage could be far greater. Not because the Earth is stronger, but because the structures of modern life are more fragile in some ways. Gas lines, power grids, sprawling cities unprepared for tremors. And yet, there is a strange comfort in this story too. For scientists, the Dogger Bank earthquake was not just a catastrophe. It was a revelation. It forced Britain to take seismology seriously. It inspired research into its hidden geology, leading to discoveries about glacial rebound, about buried landscapes like Doggerland, and about the silent forces that shape even the most seemingly peaceful corners of the Earth. In a way, the quake gave Britain a new awareness, that the island is not as still as it seems, and that history is written not only in books but also in the shifting stones beneath our feet. Even now, the Dogger Bank region hums with quiet tension. Instruments placed along the seabed still detect faint tremors, whispers of the Earth's deep movements. None approach the power of 1931, but their presence is a reminder. The sea may look calm, the land may feel solid, but beneath it all, ancient forces continue their slow, invisible dance. The fault lines are still there, the crust still remembers, and the story of the Dogger Bank earthquake is not finished. The quake of 1931 was not just an accident of history. It was the Earth reminding Britain of its place in a restless, shifting world. And as scientists continue to probe the seabed, mapping faults and measuring stresses, one unsettling truth becomes clear. The North Sea has shaken before, and one day it will shake again. Earthquakes in Britain are rare enough that when they do strike, they often become etched into local memory for generations. People talk about the shaking of their houses, the rattling of crockery, the sudden burst of fear when the solid ground beneath their feet seems to betray them. Yet, compared to the seismic dramas of California or Japan, most British earthquakes are modest, sharp reminders of the Earth's power, but rarely catastrophic. And still, when placed side by side, none of them compare to the night the Dogger Bank shook in 1931. Take, for example, the Ilowan Peninsula earthquake of 1984. At magnitude 5.4, it was the strongest quake felt on land in the United Kingdom during the 20th century. It struck just after midnight on July 19th, its epicenter off the coast of Gwynedd in North Wales. Windows rattled, chimneys crumbled, and frightened families rushed out into the cool night air, unsure of what had just happened. People as far away as Ireland, Scotland, and even the Isle of Man reported feeling the tremors. For many, it was the first and only earthquake they would ever experience. And yet, despite its size, damage was relatively light. Walls cracked, roof tiles slid loose, but no one was killed. Compared to the devastation earthquakes bring in other corners of the world, it was a dramatic but mercifully gentle reminder of Britain's hidden faults. Just 6 years later, in 1990, the Bishop's Castle earthquake struck Shropshire with a magnitude of 5.1. Once again, the timing was uncanny. It hit in the early hours of the morning, jolting people awake with a roar and a rumble that seemed to rise from beneath their very floorboards. Buildings shook, ornaments tumbled from shelves, and church bells rang without human hands to set them swinging. For a few heart-stopping seconds, it felt like the very earth was tearing itself apart. But when the dust settled, there was little lasting harm. The quake left behind more stories than scars, tales passed down in villages and towns of that night the earth moved. Then came the Dudley earthquake in 2002, a magnitude 4.8 shock that rippled through the West Midlands. By global standards, it was small. By British standards, it was big enough to be felt by more than 1 million people. Dudley residents recalled the walls groaning, the glass panes clattering, and the sudden rush of adrenaline that came with not knowing if this was the beginning of something bigger. No lives were lost, but chimneys cracked, ceilings split, and emergency services were flooded with calls from bewildered people who thought they were hearing an explosion or a plane crash. Once again, the quake revealed how unprepared Britain is for such moments, even when they are minor by international measure. And yet, as remarkable as these modern quakes were, they pale beside the 1931 Dogger Bank earthquake. At magnitude 6.1, it was in another league entirely, an order of magnitude more powerful than Dudley, larger than Bishop's Castle, greater even than Ilowan Peninsula. What set it apart was not just its size but its reach. Reports of shaking stretched from Scotland to Belgium, from the Netherlands to Ireland. Chimneys fell, church spires twisted, statues toppled, and in some places, the sea itself stirred into unnatural motion. It was, quite simply, the most powerful earthquake in British history, and it remains unbeaten to this day. But here's the terrifying truth. Even the Dogger Bank quake might not represent the upper limit of what Britain could face. Geologists know that the crust beneath the North Sea is laced with old fault lines, scars of ancient upheavals, still quietly bearing the weight of stresses passed down through millennia. The glacial rebound that helped trigger 1931 is still ongoing. In theory, another quake of similar or even greater size could strike again. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for decades, but someday. And so, as people in Dudley Bishop's Castle, or the Iron Peninsula recall the nights their homes rattled and their dishes fell, they are remembering only whispers of a deeper danger. The Dogger Bank quake showed Britain that the ground beneath its feet is not as stable as it seems. The smaller shocks that followed in later decades are like echoes, faint reminders that the island is still stitched together by restless faults. But the real question, the one that keeps scientists awake at night, is simple and chilling. If 1931 was not the worst Britain could face, then what happens when the Earth decides to test its strength again? Picture this. It's the early hours of the morning, the kind of quiet when most of Britain is asleep. Streetlights cast their glow on empty roads. The North Sea lies calm under a blanket of stars, and the hum of modern life is subdued. But then, without warning, the deep seabed beneath Dogger Bank convulses. A magnitude 6.1 earthquake, identical in strength to the one that struck in 1931, rips through the crust, and suddenly, the calm night turns into chaos. The shock waves radiate outward with astonishing speed. Within seconds, the vibrations are racing toward the coast. Houses in Hull and Scarborough shudder as windows rattle and ornaments tumble from shelves. Modern skyscrapers in Leeds and Manchester, built with engineering far stronger than in the 1930s, still sway unnervingly, their steel frames groaning against stresses they were never expected to face. Elevators grind to a halt, alarms blare, and security cameras capture surreal footage of entire buildings trembling as though gripped by some invisible giant. Across the North Sea, oil rigs and gas pipelines, Britain's modern lifelines, are suddenly vulnerable. These structures, engineered to withstand storms and gales, face a new kind of threat, the violent buckling of the seabed itself. Engineers in control rooms scramble to shut down operations, fearing ruptures that could spill crude oil into the sea or ignite devastating fires. The North Sea, long harnessed for energy and profit, has become a stage for disaster. And then, the sea begins to move in a way that feels unnatural. Fishing vessels rocking in the darkness report a sudden surge, as though the water itself has been yanked by some unseen force. Buoys tilt and roll, their warning lights blinking erratically. In coastal towns, the tide retreats slightly, almost imperceptibly at first, just enough to expose patches of seabed that should not be visible. For those awake and watching, it would feel wrong, eerie. A hidden tsunami, small by Pacific standards but large enough for Britain's shallow waters, gathers momentum as it pushes toward shore. Hull, Scarborough, Whitby, the waves reach these towns first. Sea walls tremble as the surge crashes in, flooding harbors and tossing fishing boats against the docks. In low-lying streets, drains overflow, cars are lifted, and storefronts vanish beneath rushing water. For emergency responders, the nightmare has only begun. Sirens wail, evacuation orders spread through mobile alerts, and thousands scramble in the dark for higher ground. Further south, the tsunami's energy races along the coast. The Humber estuary funnels water inland, swelling rivers and threatening towns miles from the open sea. And though the energy dissipates with distance, scientists warn of the unthinkable. If the wave were strong enough, it could ripple toward the Thames estuary. London, with its dense population, nuclear power facilities, and delicate financial heart, could find itself staring down the echoes of a disaster first recorded nearly a century ago. Now imagine the ripple effects beyond the water. Gas pipelines beneath the North Sea fracture under strain, leading to shortages and surging prices. Offshore wind farms, symbols of Britain's green future, buckle under shifting seabeds. The internet itself could falter. Vital undersea cables, stretched across the continental shelf, might snap in an instant, cutting off digital lifelines between Britain and the rest of Europe. In a world so dependent on connectivity, the quake would not just shake buildings, it would shake the very fabric of modern society. And then comes the lingering danger. Nuclear plants along Britain's eastern coast. They are designed with robust safety systems, but in the wake of Fukushima, The world knows all too well how a natural disaster can escalate into a nuclear emergency. Engineers would race to shut down reactors, to keep cooling systems running, to ensure the lights stay on. Yet the margin for error under pressure is razor thin. For a few hours, perhaps even days, Britain could find itself holding its breath. The financial impact alone would be staggering. Billions of pounds in damages. Insurance claims skyrocketing. Stock markets rattling. The government scrambling to reassure a shaken public that the crisis is under control. International headlines would scream of Britain's big quake, while experts crowd the airwaves, some insisting it was a once-in-a-century freak, others warning that the North Sea might still hold worse surprises. Because here's the twist. Scientists today acknowledge what their predecessors in 1931 could not. The Dogger Bank quake, powerful as it was, may not have been the largest that the North Sea is capable of producing. Geological evidence suggests that even bigger quakes could occur, driven by ancient fault lines and the slow but relentless rebound of land still adjusting from the last ice age. In other words, Britain's most powerful earthquake might not remain unmatched forever. So the question becomes more chilling than ever. If a 6.1 quake can cause this much chaos in our modern interconnected world, what would happen if the North Sea unleashed something larger? The thought alone is enough to unsettle a nation that still thinks of itself as earthquake-free. And while scientists monitor the seabed with seismographs and sensors, one truth remains unavoidable. Just as in 1931, there would be no warning. One moment, Britain sleeps peacefully. The next, the Earth itself turns traitor. The North Sea rests quietly now. Its waves roll and retreat in their endless rhythm, lapping gently against the invisible contours of Dogger Bank far beneath the surface. Above, seabirds skim the water, calling out into the open sky, as if nothing extraordinary ever happened here. To the untrained eye, it is simply another corner of the sea. Calm, steady, timeless. But deep below, the scars of that June night in 1931 remain etched into the earth. Silent reminders of a moment when the sea itself seemed to wake from its slumber. That earthquake lasted only a minute or two, but its echo lingers nearly a century later. Chimneys fell, walls cracked, monuments shifted, and one life was lost. Not to falling rubble, but to fear itself. It rattled homes, but more than that, it rattled belief. Until then, Britain thought of itself as safe from such violence of the earth. The quake forced a reckoning. A reminder that no land is beyond nature's reach. Today, as fishing boats still crisscross Dogger Bank and cargo ships carve paths across the North Sea, few think about what lies beneath them. They sail above a fault line that once flexed with terrifying power, a place where the seabed buckled and sent tremors rippling across an entire nation. For scientists, Dogger Bank remains a puzzle. Why here, why then, and could it happen again? They measure, they monitor, but certainty remains elusive. And so, the memory of 1931 lives on not just in history books, but in quiet unease. The sea does not forget. Every wave that crashes against the cliffs of Yorkshire, every tide that rises in the Humber, seems to carry whispers from that night. It is as if the waters themselves hold the memory, waiting for the moment when the earth might stir once more. Perhaps it will be decades, perhaps centuries. But one truth cannot be ignored. The forces that shaped Britain's past still lie beneath its feet. The people of 1931 had no warning. No sirens, no text alerts, no satellites watching from above. Only the sudden roar of the ground, the terrifying sway of walls and steeples, and the unshakable fear that something impossible was happening. If it came again today, the story would look different. But the fear, the shock, would be just as real. As the camera pulls back, the sea stretches wide, endless and calm, as though nothing could disturb it. But we know better. The quake of 1931 proved it. For one brief night, Britain learned that even the firmest ground can betray us. And in the end, the reflection is simple, almost haunting. The earthquake was brief, but its lesson endures. The ground beneath Britain is not as still as we imagine. The North Sea carries its memory in silence, waiting, patient. The sea remembers. The only question is, will we?